Alright, in this video we're going to be talking about morality. Is morality subjective or is it objective? Is it wrong to murder, officially, absolutely, objectively, or is it subjective? We're going to deal with issues like this, and these are important issues, to be sure. And I've talked about this before, but I think I have some new things to bring to the table, so bear with me. I read a book called After Virtue, and I'd recommend it to you guys out there, but I know most of you probably won't end up reading it. So why don't I just explain what the book proposes and do my best to articulate the argument found in the book. The book opens up with a scenario. Imagine a world where people hate science, and they actually kill scientists and burn textbooks and destroy technology and persecute and ostracize supporters of science and all that sort of stuff. Now imagine many years go by and then there's a renaissance where people attempt to recover science. So what they end up doing is piecing together fragments of burned books or bits and pieces of technology, and they kind of pool it all together and they attempt to recover science. And what they end up doing, perhaps, is they recover much of the language of science. So they'll use words like the scientific method, or they'll use even categories of scientific inquiry like biology or astronomy. And maybe in the individual fields, they'll even have the words that we typically use, like in astronomy, like galaxies and nebula and supernova. However, there's a distinction between the way that people use it in the recovered state versus the old way that people used it. And the distinction is this. The recovered science, when it uses these scientific words, perhaps they don't have the same content as they once did. Perhaps so much information is missing that when someone says supernova, they don't mean the explosion of a star anymore. What they mean is, on page 300 of that broken book or a scrap of paper, there is a diagram of a supernova which seems to have maybe something to do with... it's too vague to be very specific about. But that's what the modern science, in this recovered state of science, has come to call the supernova. And it's robbed of its original context in the way it was discovered, and it has none of the information, the content of the original discovery. Only the language remains. So if you overheard a conversation in the recovered science state, you'd hear words like, nebula or supernova, and you may even be deceived into thinking that they were talking scientifically, but they're not. They're only talking about what they've recovered, and that's not much. Now, what's the point of all this? The author of the book argues that something like this has happened with morality, that there was once a foundation, a robust understanding of morality, and that was rebelled against during the Enlightenment period. And now people still use the language. They've recovered the language of morality. So they say things like right and wrong, good and evil, but those words don't mean what they once did. And I'm going to explain what the distinction is. Let's take a look at traditional morality versus modern morality and see if we can really make a distinction between the two and maybe see a few problems in the modern system of morality. The Enlightenment Project, as the book After Virtue calls it, is the attempt of the Enlightenment world, the world post-Enlightenment, of trying to justify their moral system. Now, let's look at the traditional view before the Enlightenment, what it looked like. This is the view that Aristotle and Augustine and many of the famous philosophers of the past held to. Alright, so let's take a look at the traditional view of morality. I believe that there's been a moral crisis in our culture which has resulted in moral relativism and moral subjectivity, which leaves us without a true method to judge between what is right and what is wrong. And those who claim to have a standard are actually now seen as bigoted, close-minded, and dangerous to our culture, sort of like the scenario with people rebelling against science. Now here's what I believe happened. The traditional view of morality made a distinction between what is moral and immoral by way of a guiding law. In the West, we call it the law of God. In the East, they called it the Tao. Now, the law of God, or the Tao, was not to be defined by man, but was meant to be strived towards. It was not to be altered by man, but it was meant to alter us. The traditional view is that there is man as he is, and man as he should be. The way to distinguish between the two was the law of God, or the Tao. Our modern culture has denied entirely the existence of this law, leaving only the moral injunction and language of right and wrong. Man as he is and man as he should be, but without a standard by which to judge which category to place certain behaviors. Therefore, when we observe that man is a homosexual or a heterosexual, a murderer or a savior, a pedophile, a rapist, a thief, how do we know which category to put it in? At this point, it is only a matter of personal preference, and the danger is this. What if we put something in the wrong category and justify something that is actually immoral? What if that law of God does exist? Once you reject the law of God or the Tao or the objective standard, you are left with absolute moral chaos, moral relativism, emotivism, utilitarianism, and all other failed attempts at justifying morality. It boils down to this. Either man defines what is right for man to do, in which case no man can tell any other man what is right or wrong, or something that is not man defines what is right and wrong for man to do, and will judge man according to that standard. The traditional view predicts that man as he is, by nature, will hate the idea that he could ever be in the wrong, and the traditional view is designed, by definition, to put at odds the way man is versus the way he ought to be. So if this view is correct, we should expect man as he is to reject the Tao, to reject the law of God, as well as the idea that man ought to be any which way. And I suppose that gives some people license in their mind to be any which way they want to be, to define their own morality, to be their own God, which of course is precisely the lie of Satan in the Garden of Eden. That's his shtick. It's to deny what God said and to pretend that there actually is no defined set law in stone, but that we need to make up for ourselves what is right or wrong. The beauty of the Tao and the law of God as a guiding principle, and the fact that it is objective, is the idea that it is the best possible behavior for man to reach his ultimate purpose, his telos, going back to teleology. And again, this is not something detectable by science. So to reject, because of scientific inquiry, the Tao or the law of God, because you haven't discovered it using the scientific method, well, again, I'd like to caution you. Science could never discover these things, and that doesn't mean they don't exist. Now, I'd like to play a clip from a video. I'm going to show you, I found someone on YouTube who really does exhibit the very problem we're looking at here. So I'm going to play a clip.
That's the whole point, Sean. Science can't prove these things because they are subjective. The value of life is different for different people, the same as the importance and meaning of marriage. Science can only prove that which is objective. Therefore, your argument that because science can't find the value of life, among other similar things, that we should just look to the Bible as our sole source for this information is incorrect. The Bible's interpretation is just as subjective as anyone else's. Therefore, I have no need for the Bible as a source for these things.
I couldn't disagree with this person more. And if you're watching this, please don't feel like I'm picking on you or anything like that. I think that what you've said is very typical. You are an excellent sampling of what I feel like the majority of our Western culture is sort of shifting towards. The idea that the biblical view is just one of many views, and that it is what you say, subjective. But what I've been arguing in my videos is quite the opposite, and allow me to make a more robust argument. Let me look at the first thing you said. You said that the value of life differs from person to person. This fails to appreciate the video that you were making a response to, which is, what if there is a creator? Let's entertain the hypothetical for a moment. What if the creator created life with a certain purpose in mind, and that purpose, that value, is something that he has endowed on the creation? So that means all of humanity participates in a single purpose, and that is external to us, that purpose is, because it doesn't come from man's mind, it comes from God's mind. So it's objective to us because it's not subjective. We can't manipulate it or change it. It is external and objective to us. In that case, again, I'm not saying that you need to assume that I'm correct or even believe that I'm correct. I'm merely entertaining the hypothetical if that is the case. And we already know, due to what we've been discussing, that science would not be able to necessarily detect this objective value, this telos of man that I'm proposing. Should we be so quick to assume that what the Bible is saying is indeed subjective? Because what it presents is actually an objective view of morality, that there is something external to mankind that does not come from mankind that is going to judge man according to this standard, which would make it an objective standard. We're talking about marriage. What if, again, the hypothetical, not asking you to believe it, but what if God ordained marriage? What if he invented marriage? What if marriage is defined by God's standard, and that all marriages will be judged according to how well they conformed to that standard. One man, one woman in holy matrimony, that infidelity and divorce would not be tolerated. Sex with other partners outside the marriage covenant would not be tolerated. And that homosexuals cannot be married because marriage is defined as one man and one woman in this marriage covenant. What if that is the objective moral standard? Now you may say, well then, why is it that men disagree amongst each other about these certain values? Why do some men value life and others don't? Why do some feel homosexuality is okay and others don't? And it goes back to the removal of the law of God and simply having the moral injunction of man is versus how he ought to be. We already should expect that man will want to rebel against the way he ought to be, if this is true, which means we may end up putting things like homosexuality into the man as he ought because we only see man as he is, and we don't see the law of God. And so that's my concern, that I think you've jumped the gun. You've defined the Bible as having a subjective view of morality, and I'm not convinced that it is. In fact, I'm convinced of the opposite. I'm convinced that that is the absolute standard, and when we die, we will be judged by it. Every person, according to that standard, and we can't change it. I believe it's an objective standard. Now, as for why I believe that, I can't do that in this video. I don't think we have enough time left, but that's something else. In order to demonstrate that, I'd have to give reasons for why I believe the Bible is true, but that's not what I'm attempting to do here. All I'm attempting to do is illustrate that if the Bible's standards are correct, if there is a creator, if man does have a single unified purpose, a telos, and if there is an objective morality, we should not conclude, just because our scientific endeavors have not discovered them, that therefore they don't exist, that should really make us hesitant to say, well, therefore, because we haven't discovered it yet, let's just let homosexuals get married. Well, what if their eternal souls are in jeopardy? What if we end up justifying and say it's okay to abort babies and other things that we start to accept in our culture? What if these things are wrong? And what if people are going to be judged by them? And that's why I'm raising this as an issue. So, again, I don't expect you to walk away from this video thinking that the Bible's true, as I've made no argument for such a thing. What I have argued is that just by way of our scientific inquiry, that has not excluded the possibility that what I'm telling you is the case. And that should make us a little more hesitant to conclude that, well, therefore, I don't need the Bible. I think we may need it a little more than we think.